Hey everyone, welcome to the Department of Comics. My name is Efren, and we have a very special guest with us today. Comic book writer of books, Spencer Locke, The OZ, and Scout's Honor, just to name a few, David Pepose. Before we go any further, David, the floor is all yours if you have anything to say.
No, I'm just really excited to be on the show. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I'm excited to talk comics with you tonight.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I just started reading your books, but I got hooked when I read the first couple of pages of Spencer and Locke.
Thank
But
you.
we'll get into that in a little bit. I was going to ask you, did you collect comic books as a child?
Yeah, I'm actually a third generation comics fan. My mother was a comics reader. My grandfather was a comics reader. So I definitely come by all this honestly. I consider comics, it's really my astronaut job. And so I consider myself so fortunate and so privileged to be able to kind of take that passion I've had going all the way back to Amazing Spider-Man 346, my very first comic, and being able to turn this into my career. I'm pinching myself every day I get to do this. And it really inspires me to try to bring my A game with every script I turn in.
I can tell that. And as a fan of comic books and writers, I want to say thank you very much. I read at the back of one of your books that you used to be a crime reporter. How did you make the transition from crime reporter to comic books? I was like, wow. To me, I was like, that's very fascinating.
You know, it's funny because I mean, comics, one of the great things about them, it's very egalitarian in the way that you break in. Unless you've got a career elsewhere like film or television or novels, something that's like storytelling based. The way you break into comics is you make a comic. And so you could be a crime reporter, you could be an airplane pilot, you could be a dentist. And if you can make a comic, then you're already in. But it's funny, my career trajectory, it's certainly, it wasn't a straight line, definitely more of like a zigzag pattern. When I was in college, I kind of thought to myself, what's my astronaut job? You know, if I could do anything in the world for a living, what would it be? And working in comics was the only answer. And so I knocked on the doors of DC Comics for 3 years running. They gave me an internship just as I graduated my senior year. It was the summer of '08. I worked on books like Final Crisis and Batman R.I.P. and Green Lantern Secret Origins. But that was also the summer of the recession. And so there were no jobs to be had. And when I was in college, I kind of worked in journalism and theater. Those were sort of the closest things to comics that I could get to in my undergrad program. And so I kind of, I cast as wide of a net as I could in newspaper jobs. And so I worked for a newspaper called the Berkshire Eagle in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. I started there. My first day was Martin Luther King Day 2009. So I believe that was the day before Barack Obama was inaugurated, or maybe day of. So yeah, it was a wonderful experience, and one that really kind of, in ways I would not have imagined, really did prepare me for working in comics. I covered crime, and in the Berkshires in particular, it's northeastern resort towns next to like abject poverty. And, you really you cross a couple of blocks and you can see a very stark difference in living conditions. But it's also, there's rural elements, there's former GE towns, manufacturing towns, and then, sort of the hoity-toity artsy fartsy vacation community. And so that was interesting just in terms of navigating different stories and different people. But working in a newspaper was really important for me in terms of not being afraid of a deadline and not being afraid of a word count. You have to put together a story. You have to do it every single day. And so you really learn how to be resourceful. You learn to think on your feet. You learn not to take no for an answer. And these are all skills you need to work in comics. And so it was one of those things. It's funny. I worked as a crime reporter for a while. And then I actually wound up going back to school for publishing. I went to Columbia for their publishing program. And through that, kind of tripped and fell into a job in television. I worked in publicity for CBS television in New York. And I was there for about 5 years. And it's funny. That career, it was very stable. It was very helpful in that regard, but it wasn't really creatively fulfilling. And I think I needed that to kind of push me into starting to do some creative stuff on the side. Writing my own scripts, eventually kind of getting artists on board, starting to sort of shop them around. That's how Spencer and Locke got made. It was kind of, slowly dipped my toe in the pool, saying, oh, writing a script, that was fun. Oh, let me get an artist. That was fun. Let me pitch it. Let's just see what happens. And I dipped my toe in the pool enough that I then fell into the deep end on accident. And they said, I got a publisher to say, when can you get this book done?
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, once that book came out, it's sort of the scales kind of fell from my eyes a little bit. I grew up in the Midwest. I never really had any creative role models. I didn't know a whole lot of people who did writing for a living. Even when Spencer and Locke came out, I was convinced that I was going to try to work as an editor. And it wasn't until the book came out and people liked it that the light bulb went off and I said, oh, idiot. Like if you can write, just write. You don't have to use writing as a means for an end for something else. And so I've been doing that ever since. It's been, a really, it's been a fun career, and it's really been validating for me, realizing that all these things I took from my previous jobs that I thought wouldn't mean anything in the future, and realizing like, no, this is the long game. You're thinking in terms of years, in terms of decades, and realizing that there were a lot of very important skill sets from my previous jobs that wound up paying off in some big and unexpected ways in my creative career.
So how much research do you do beforehand? Say for Spencer and Locke, I mean, you start writing it, obviously the script and everything, but from, how much research did you do from Spencer and Locke, for example?
Yeah, I tend to do a lot of, I tend to do the research that I think fits the project. So for example, for Spencer and Locke, and for those who haven't read my book, Spencer and Locke, that was my first book. It's kind of my breakout book. And the high concept for that is, what if Calvin and Hobbes grew up in Sin City?
Yeah.
And so I read the entirety of Bill Watterson's Calvin and Hobbes, literally from the first strip to the last. And I've done that. I did that for the first volume. I reread it for the second volume. I reread it a third time for volume 3, which I'm in the process of working on right now. So in that sense, I did a lot of research. As far as the psychological components, that was an interesting, again, talking about the things you wouldn't expect to pay off later on. When I was working as a newspaper reporter, one of the sort of sub beats that I had, I covered the local military beat and the local mental health beat. And so I was interviewing a lot of returning soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, coming back to the Berkshires, particularly like in an economically impoverished time for a region that was already economically impoverished, and kind of hearing about, how they dealt with trauma and how they dealt with returning back home. Mm-hmm. Those stories really those really kind of stayed with me in a big way. Sure. And I think they've certainly gone on to inform a lot of the themes that I tackle in my books, in terms of trauma and, how do we live with trauma? Can we get past trauma? Does trauma define us? Those things I think are really important. For me, a lot of it is about figuring out the tone and the vibe of it all. And that's really where I do a lot of my research. For example, if I was going to write, a college frat story, throw that out there. If I wanted to do my own spin on Animal House.
Okay. I was just thinking Animal House. I was going to say that to you, but
I would be looking at all sort of the seminal stuff. I'd be looking at, I'd be looking at Animal House. I'd be looking at the show Greek. I'd be looking at, American Pie and the American Pie spinoffs. Anything, Revenge of the Nerds, even though that's kind of like very dated at this point and kind of problematic. Figuring out like what are comp titles, to use a phrase from my Columbia days, just what else is in that space and what can I sort of figure out, all right, like what's already been done and then how can I subvert that? Mm-hmm. That's really like, I certainly do my own fair share of reading in terms of just like how do things get put together. But for me, the most important part of a story is how does it make you feel as a reader? I feel like there's so many books out there on the stands competing for your attention that my thinking is I'd honestly rather somebody hate my books than feel nothing about them. I feel like apathy is the only wrong response here. And so I always try to think really hard about like, how do I make a stranger give a damn? How can I leave you with some sort of emotion, whether it's making you cry or making you laugh, or ideally some sort of combination thereof. That hasn't steered me wrong so far.
Nice. So as far as your collaboration with an artist, do you choose the artist yourself, or does the publisher choose an artist for you? And how long does it take for you to complete a book? Like say Spencer Locke, the first issue, how long did it take you to finish issue just number 1?
So it's a great question. And it kind of depends on the project, and it depends on the publisher. Most of my projects, with the exception of Scout's Honor, I've selected my own art teams, which is a challenge in and of itself. When you're working on a book like that, you become sort of a de facto editor. You're the ringleader. The buck stops with you. And so you have to keep yourself motivated. You have to keep your team motivated. You have to be sort of not just the writer, but you have to be the art director and the hype man and the financier and the therapist and the priest and the traffic cop. Whereas a book like Scout's Honor, where I'm working with a publisher who wants to be more hands-on in the development process, that was the first series that I've ever worked on that my editors actually match-made a creative team for me. And that has its own benefits and its own challenges to it. Not being the editor means that you have to work with the editors in terms of figuring out what's the best vision of this book. And sort of you have your own sensibilities as an artist or as a creator, and your publisher has its own directives and its own obligations that it wants to fulfill, and figuring out kind of where's the happy medium here, where does that overlap and intersect. As far as how long does it take to put a book together, some of that will depend on the artist. Certain artists draw faster than others. It depends on their style and what other work they're working on. For me, writing, it usually takes me 6 to 8 weeks to come up with an outline. And that's sort of just the kind of book report synopsis version of a story. And then once that's done, it tends to move a little faster. I can usually write a first issue script 2 to 3 weeks. And then usually I can kind of crank through every other issue in about that much time, maybe a little less. Spencer and Locke was an interesting book, though, because that was the fastest I've ever written anything ever. I wrote the treatment for that series, I think, in a couple of days. And I wound up writing that first issue. I think it took me less than a week. That was a horrible bar to start off with, because nothing I've ever written has moved that quickly. Certainly not in the pitch stage as well. I mean, I got a green light the same day that I sent that pitch into Action Lab, which has never happened since. It never will happen again. I got very lucky on my first book. But yeah, as far as, really the hard part is just kind of the production of it all. I mean, as a writer, I can be promiscuous. I can work on several different scripts and projects at once because, like, I'm not putting in backbreaking physical labor to do so. An artist, on the other hand, they're if they're lucky, they can work on 2 projects at once. It's just you don't want to blow out somebody's wrist. Like, that becomes like a career-ending injury.
Sure.
So it depends on the artist. I think usually most of the people I work with will take, assuming that life doesn't like throw them a curveball, usually about 2 months per issue. I know that's a little on the slower end.
Yeah.
Once you get to like kind of pro level, you usually can get an issue out every 5 to 6 weeks. But I tend to work with newer talent, and I would much rather, this is the benefit I have of being an indie creator, I'd much rather my team take a little longer to get it right than to kind of rush through it. We don't, the only book that I've ever had like a really, really hard deadline, and I can't even say hard deadline, like challenging, but just this is a set deadline, was Scout's Honor. And, once that book got greenlit, it was, turn in a script every month, and we'll get you line art within, 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And that, honestly, working for that was actually probably the easiest deadline I ever hit, just because it's a bigger publisher, and so I kind of felt a fire under my feet, and so I was turning in scripts about every 2 weeks for that series.
Can you draw at all?
Sorry, no.
Can you draw at all?
Very, very cartoonishly. I would never be able to like draw a comic book. I was the cartoonist for my high school paper.
Oh, nice.
So I did draw a pretty terrible comic strip in high school. But I tend to leave that to the professionals. Like I said, I grew up in the Midwest. If somebody had told me that like reference art was a thing, I probably would have a very different different career right now. I didn't know that was a thing until I was like 25, 26, and sort of the ship had sailed as far as me becoming a professional artist. But yeah, in a parallel universe, there's another me that is really good with drawing and just does all his own stuff.
You took one of my questions away from me. So Spencer and Locke, there's no volume 3 right now, correct?
Yeah, I'm working on it right now.
Okay.
Yeah, me and George Santiago Jr. The thing I always tell everybody, because a lot of people ask me, "Where's volume 3? Where's volume 3?" And I always say, well, there's a difference, because between volumes 1 and 2, I basically wrote them consecutively. I didn't have any other projects like in between that. Since volume 2, I've written, I think, 6 or 7 other books. So I've had other balls in the air, but also it's a lot more research. We're doing a Garfield themed serial killer is picking off the Peanuts gang.
Sure.
And so it's really, if you think trying to emulate Bill Watterson is like climbing the mountain, imagine trying to do, Charles Schultz and Jim Davis. It's like, it's really the 3 heavyweights. So we're working a little slowly because I want to make sure like we really stick the landing on this. This is going to be kind of the exclamation point at the end of the sentence that is Spencer and Locke. But yeah, I'm very excited that, the team is coming back together. Knock on wood, as long as nobody gets hit by a bus, we should be fine. But yes, we're hard at work on that right now. That's actually front and center on my agenda at this moment, besides moving apartments. But yeah, it's something that's been brewing for a long time. We have a lot of really fun ideas for this book, and yeah, I'm excited for it to eventually hit the stands. We don't really have a date yet because like I'm still kind of fine tuning bits of the story here and there. But yeah, I'm excited for this one. This is sort of it's the end of an era in a lot of ways, and it's the end of my first big series, and I want to make sure that we do right by our fans and do right by our characters and really kind of end the series off with a bang.
I thought volume 3 was already out, and I went on eBay looking for it. I wanted to buy it. I was like, wait a minute. And I seen some, there was a post there that
yes, Joe Mulvey and I worked on a poster together with our Garfield themed serial killer graffitied on it. So yes, it's in process right now. Any slowness is purely on me, just based on, just writing other books. But I feel like it's going to be kind of a complicated thing. We're juggling 3 different strips now, and presumably I'm going to be trying to do this in the same amount of real estate. So it's just making sure that we do right by everything, because yeah, this book, more than anything I've ever written, it's a high wire act. You really want to make sure that you do right by Bill Watterson and by Charles Schultz and by Jim Davis, and making sure that all of their characters are presented in a way that makes sense. I never wrote this book to like be a ripoff of Calvin and Hobbes, or like, God forbid, to be like, I hate Calvin and Hobbes. I love Calvin and Hobbes. I think Bill Watterson's like a pioneer and an innovator and a trailblazer. I was just reading an interview that he did it in the complete Calvin and Hobbes. And I was just reading all this stuff. I'm like, I so agree. He's so dead on. And so it's a love letter. And so I want to make sure that before we send this love letter out, it's really to the best of my abilities, for sure.
Speaking of Calvin and Hobbes, and also The Wizard of Oz, did you need permission from the estates of both of those books, so to speak of?
So for Spencer and Locke, it's well, both of them are parodies, so they both fall under fair use. The Wizard of Oz is also public domain.
Oh, okay.
The only thing that is not public domain within The Wizard of Oz is anything that is specific to the Judy Garland film.
Oh,
so for example, that's why we talk about in the OZ, we talk about the Silver Slippers, is because that's what L. Frank Baum had in his original novels. And so that is available for public, whereas the Ruby Slippers were actually an invention for Technicolor.
Oh.
And so you can't use those without getting sued by Warner Brothers. But it's pretty surprising that, there's only very little things that you kind of have to work around as far as The Wizard of Oz is concerned. And then, for Spencer and Locke, just making sure that it's very, very clear this is a distinct work, that this is about a hard-boiled detective and his imaginary Blue Panther, and just saying like, oh, well, if you squint, you know what we're referring to. But that's also part of the reason why for volumes 2 and 3, we threw in other strips to homage. Is the more we do that, the more it's considered a transformative work.
Sure.
Like a remix. And so, it's, but at the same time, even like taking aside sort of the legal component, just there are people who are diehard fans of Calvin and Hobbes and Peanuts and Garfield.
I'm one of them. So.
And I want to make sure that I do my best not to tick those people off. It's sort of, you can poke a little fun, but you want to make sure that you're still reverent of the source material, and that you present it in a way that doesn't feel mean-spirited.
Sure.
That really kind of speaks to these characters. I think it's very easy to be edgy. That gets your foot in the door once. But I want to make sure that with my books, we establish some sort of emotional connection, because at the end of the day, edginess is cheap. But if I can make you connect with our characters, that it creates that sort of investment and engagement that keeps you reading for the long haul.
When I started reading Spencer Locke, I go, wait a minute, is this Panther alive or not? Because that's how good the writing was. I'm going, God, I think he is alive. I go, no, he's not. So.
Well, there's a scene that I'm not going to spoil, but there's a scene in the first volume, and you'll probably know what it is when you see it, that's sort of my answer to that question. And it's because a lot of my friends, when I was writing the scripts and I was showing them to my friends, they kept asking, well, is Spencer real? Is he real? And I gave my own answer that I think is it's probably an infuriating answer, but I think it's the only correct one for this series. And but yeah, I'm glad that though that's when I write something that it evokes these kinds of questions, it just means that I'm doing my job. And so thank you for that.
Yeah, you took away another one of my questions. I was going to ask you if you let your family or friends read your books beforehand.
Yeah, definitely. I'm very lucky that I think I have a pretty strong brain trust. My girlfriend is my number one reader. I feel like I often kind of write these things just to entertain her, as long as the two of us are entertained, like sure. Everybody else is just kind of secondary. It's funny. My partner, she's not a comics fan. She didn't grow up reading any of this, but she is a voracious reader of fiction. And so I feel like she's a really good litmus test in terms of like, is this thing accessible? Am I anchoring it with real emotion? Or is this just kind of like, random high concept comic book nonsense that like a civilian's not going to get? She's kind of like sort of the North Star for all of this. And then I have friends, I probably should have mentioned this when I was talking about my career. The way that I kind of kept my foot in the comics industry after I left DC, I was the reviews editor at Newsarama for about a decade.
Okay.
So a lot of the reviewers that I met there, and I handpicked and recruited the vast majority of them. I'm still close with many of them. And so there are a few people like my friends, George Marston and Pierce Lydon, and Troy Brownfield, who's kind of my mentor and my predecessor as the reviews editor there. They're all important parts of my brain trust. I'm always bouncing ideas off of them. Sometimes it's just something like, does this thing exist? And half the time they're like, yes, you've invented the Matrix, or you've invented Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Like this already happened, so don't run with that. But at other times, I'm sort of able to kind of feel my way through a story by just being like, well, what do you think about this? Does this make sense? Does this evoke any sort of emotional response in you? I try to be careful with who I talk to, you want to talk with people whose creative sensibilities align with your own, or at least overlap enough that you feel like, okay, like I'm trying to tell the right story here to the right people. But you want to make sure you trust them,
Sure.
And so I've been really lucky and fortunate that I've found people that I trust. And that sort of helps me, I think, fine tune and quality control my own work before it goes out in the public.
I'm just saying, you have my email address, and I'm a fan. If you ever want, I won't show it to anybody. I cross my heart, and all that stuff, So you mentioned Aftershock a little bit. How much leeway do they give you writing books? Do you have to check in with them like every week, or do they call you for updates, or do you notify them?
So, so it's funny. My relationship with Aftershock, I think it's unique compared to a lot of publishers that I would be working with, because I've known one of my editors, Mike Martz, since I was in college. He was one of the editors I worked under at DC when I was there. He was the Batman editor at the time. And so that was a big draw for me for working at Aftershock was, any company that was smart enough to hire Mike, I figured would be a good place to throw my hat in the ring. And it took a while to find like the right idea for them to want to develop. And even then, when they picked Scout's Honor, I was kind of surprised, because out of the long list of ideas I had sent them, Scout's Honor had been the idea that I had like just come up with like a couple of weeks prior. So I really, once they said, oh yeah, develop that one as an outline, I was sort of really kind of thinking on the fly as far as how's this story going to come together. It's a pretty communicative process. It's honestly, it feels like just as much in common with working at Marvel and DC as it does working on creator owned. I work with editors and I get approvals from editors. And so I sent them an outline when I pitched the book, and they said, okay, we like that. Why don't you write the first issue? And I wrote the first issue, and they're like, okay, we like this. We're going to greenlight the series. And then, we sort of had the conversation about artists. And meanwhile, as I signed my contract, it was like, okay, I'm contractually obligated. I need to deliver a script every month.
Okay.
And so I would send them a script, and, they would give me notes, not many notes. I mean, Aftershock gives me a pretty good amount of latitude as far as, what any changes I need to make in the story. I can say, for example, the second issue of Scout's Honor, I rewrote about 75% of it from what I had written in the outline. In fact, I had sent them a script, and have you ever had that moment where you send an email and you're like, ooh, no, I don't like that email. I wish I hadn't sent that. I wish I could take it back. I sent that email with the script, and immediately it was like, no, I could have done a better job at this. There's a better script in there. And so I spent the rest of the night kind of rewriting the whole script, and I sent them in a revised version, I think a day or so later. And I give my editor, Christina Harrington, a lot of credit, because I'm sure she could have been like, are you kidding me? Like, you just turned in a script, you're redoing it. But we had more than enough lead time that it was easy, just to be like, okay, Luca, this is actually the real script. But yeah, it's very communicative. I mean, I'm really lucky that Mike and Christina, they've looped me in on really every step of the way. So when we're getting line art from Luca Casalanguida, the artist on the book, I'd see the thumbnails, I'd see the finished inks, I'd be able to offer any suggestions as far as notes are concerned. And my editors would kind of have to weigh like, well, we have this timetable here. Is this something that's worth derailing Luca's schedule to redo, or is this something that can get fixed in the coloring stage or in the lettering stage, or do you just have to kind of pivot in order to hit the deadline? And but yeah, I think it's been a really good experience. It's been it was a little bit of a learning curve just because it's the first time I ever really worked with editors, but I think it was really helpful, and I think it's made me a more considerate and nimble writer in terms of working with my collaborators, and just really reinforcing like, okay, how do I measure twice so I only have to cut once?
Sure. I do YouTube videos on a regular basis, and I get an itch if something's not right.
Right.
Even after I'm done, I do post-production. I go, you know what? I don't like this. And I just start all over again.
Yep.
I want perfection. Put it that way,
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things, it's hard enough to get creative work out there. So you really got to love it, because you're going to be facing a lot of adversity and a lot of rejection. But I think the opposite side of that is, if you love it, you want to make sure that it gets done right, quote unquote, to whatever you consider to the best of your abilities and the best of your sensibilities. And that's something that I'm constantly wrestling with. And, the deal that I've made with myself is, look, I'm not going to be Al Ewing or Jonathan Hickman, at least not anytime soon. But if I can sort of look at the work and say, this was the best of my abilities, and that I've done something to grow as a creator, I consider that a win. And that kind of lets me go to sleep at night. As long as I do something different in every book, I feel good enough about it that I'll keep selling it whenever cons come back.
I live in San Diego. We can talk about Comic Cons all the time. You mentioned it first. I live in San Diego, so I always go to San Diego Comic Con. I've been going
Sure.
since like over 20 years. I've been going to Comic Con.
Yeah.
And I do miss it. Talking to artists as yourself, as like you, or just talking. It's a nice atmosphere.
I miss
being able
cons.
to talk to people who create all these fantastic books.
Cons, yeah, it's the part of the process that I miss the most. It certainly allowed me to focus and hunker down a bit more on my writing because I'm not traveling to 2 shows a month. But I miss it. Especially, I had a new trade drop about a month before the pandemic. By the time cons open up, the Scouts Honor trade will be out. I'll probably have a second issue of the OZ, if not, all 3 issues out. It's one of those things, like I'm sort of itching to come back, but at the same time, I've been taking this pandemic as, all right, this is sort of the universe telling you to hunker down and get some scripts out. So, I've written or finished 4 books in the pandemic. And I'm working on 3 more right now. So, I'm just trying to make the most of the time as it's been given.
Speaking of the pandemic, has COVID-19 or pandemic, has it affected your writing in any way? Made it harder for you to get stuff to the company?
So it's affected the way I work. I don't know if it's affected the way I write. And that's, I know that's a weird delineation, but comics, especially when you're a writer, you're not really just a writer because you have to be the project manager and you have to be the guy, basically your own agent, shopping around to different publishers, your own negotiator, your own hype man. That's part of the reason why I dipped my toes in the Kickstarter waters this past fall with the OZ, which will be returning to Kickstarter hopefully soon. We're looking for hopefully a May or a June release for the second issue. We had some COVID related delays, so we're sort of picking the pieces back up as far as the schedule.
I actually bought that book. I bought that book. I got it about 2 days ago.
Oh, good. I'm glad it arrived.
It arrived and I read it right away. Just to let you know.
Glad. Yeah. That got shipped directly from me, from my apartment. So I'm glad.
I thought so. I think this came directly from him.
Directly from me.
Yeah.
It was one of those things. I think any creator who didn't sort of rethink things during COVID, especially during the Diamond shutdown, they're either lying to you or they really didn't think this thing through. I think for me, it was figuring out other ways to kind of build readership and ways that are not necessarily, I think a lot of comics creators find themselves stuck asking for permission to create. And I think Kickstarter for me was like a really good reminder that you don't have to wait. You can sort of do the real garage band ethos of it all. You put your team together and you just rock out in your garage, and then you sell the tapes online. That's essentially what we did with the OZ, and really it paid off in a big way. Our Kickstarter campaign, especially when you include all the people making back end purchases, we cleared $50,000 for the first issue, and not only does that mean that like we can successfully fund the rest of the series, but it shows that it empowers me as a creator. Now I know how to do my own printing and distributing, which is something that I didn't know how to do a year ago. And so those sorts of things are really helpful for me in terms of figuring out like, okay, like, if there's a story I feel really passionate about. When I did that for Spencer and Locke, I was just shopping around from publisher to publisher and saying, I hope somebody takes it. But now it's like, well, even if I have a story, I don't have to wait for a publisher. I can reach out to a whole different demographic of comics readers. And if they like it, that's great. Then they can pick it up. And who knows, maybe then it'll have a second life in the direct market down the line. It's one of those things. I've seen plenty of Kickstarter to publisher success stories, including White Ash from my buddy Charlie Stickney over at Scout, or Black, over at Black Mask. So it's just, I think we can't limit ourselves as creators. I love the direct market. I love working with direct market publishers. The fact is I've got a book out through Aftershock right now. And, and we're talking about, potential other projects down the line. But at the same time, it's really helpful for me as a creator to know, well, if publishers are being ultra conservative in what they're picking up and what they're publishing, that doesn't mean I have to wait for them. I can do my own thing and, and let them come to me.